world politics has changed. Geopolitics is no longer simply a contest to control territory. In the age of advanced technology, it has become a contest to create a territory. Great powers seek to build a world for other states to inhabit, while keeping the ability to change the rules or the state of the world when necessary. At a moment when the old concepts no longer work, world builders aim to introduce a radically new theory of world politics and technology. Imagine a country becomes so powerful that it acquires the ability to create a virtual world. And this virtual world is so much more attractive than the real one that other countries eventually migrate to it. We live after nature, and that cannot but change the terms of geopolitical rivalry. When your opponent is building a fully artificial or technological world that could eventually redefine your own reality, geopolitics becomes not merely existential, but ontological. In a technological world, geopolitics is the struggle not to control territory, but to create it. Geopolitics return, but the prefix no longer refers to the world given to us by nature. It points to the virtual worlds we are capable of building.
That you have probably the first version of an iPhone. We have to get you a new one, I think.
That's right. Not too much into gadgets, I'll confess.
Anyhow, it's great to be here and interview Bruno. And I met Bruno in Delhi 6, 7, 8 years ago when you gave me a copy of your book on Eurasia. And I've been following him since. And I think, and many of you who would know Bruno, he's the sort of public intellectual that we'd like to all follow. His conscience, his determination, resilience, and his anger, in a good way, has stood out for me at least on a whole range of topics, including Ukraine, Gaza, and so forth. But anyway, I think most people know who you are. Where are we today? Post-Gaza, post-Ukraine, post-US elections?
Yeah, good question. So you talked about my anger. Yesterday we had a beautiful reception at Rambagh Palace, and I was walking around having a lot of food, and a EU ambassador stopped me, and he knew me from my social media, and he told me, "Oh, Bruno, you're really now in the mood of take no prisoners, huh?" And I was slightly concerned that this is the perception, but it is true to some extent. I become increasingly angry at the state of the world, and I become increasingly angry at what the West has come to represent. Gaza has a lot to do with this, but it's obviously not the only story. But what we've seen in Gaza should be shocking to everyone. I've been shocked by what has happened in Gaza, but I've also been shocked, and in some sense even more shocked by the reactions in Europe and the United States. The double standards, the contradictions are so blatant. The propaganda, the layer of propaganda is so thick and so deep that in many respects it starts to resemble what we've seen in authoritarian societies. I had to get out of my comfort zone and do a lot of journalism in the past year, because when you point out to something that has happened in Gaza, you immediately get the response, well, that's a lie, that's made up, that's Hamas propaganda, you are representing Hamas propaganda. So I actually went to Jerusalem, I went to Egypt, I met many refugees from Gaza in Cairo to tell their stories. Obviously I couldn't go to Gaza because Israel doesn't allow it. And I told, for example, the stories of the American surgeons that went to Gaza and saw hundreds, potentially thousands of very young children being killed by sniper shots from Israeli forces. And this is something that 30, 40, 50 doctors with degrees from Harvard, from Stanford, from Michigan State have documented. How is this conceivable? How is this possible? When what we represent is the deliberate killing of children with sniper shots. And yet in the West we see very little Very little commentary about the horror that is happening.
I mean, my argument is that, I've lived through quite a bit in our neck of the woods. Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, Iranian Revolution, the siege of the mosque in Mecca in the late 70s. But perhaps I would view this as one of the most consequential events of my lifetime. And we've seen what's happened in Syria, and of course that's going to continue, I think, across the Middle East. Is this the end of the rules-based international order, do you think?
Well, I've been to dinners where the expression rules-based order is mentioned and people around the table, and not necessarily people who agree with me, and former diplomats in Western countries start giggling or laughing. So it's become that kind of word, and I'm not exaggerating, because no one takes that seriously anymore. So let's try to step back a little bit, zoom out, and see the big picture. I think we're witnessing a revolutionary moment where the existing order starts to unravel, potentially to collapse. We don't know how fast it will be. But I think both Ukraine and Gaza represent this moment. I think Ukraine represents the moment where the West-led order is no longer able to impose its will. We can discuss that more in detail. And Gaza represents the moment where the West-led order no longer represents anything very valuable. So it's a two-pronged collapse.
I mean, we'll get back to Gaza and Ukraine. I think it's important to do that. Let's talk about your book, World Builders. And as we witnessed the last week or so in terms of the stock market gyrations, it seemed inevitable the West would dominate the AI arena, and the Chinese looked way, way, way behind. Tell us about World Builders. You talk about a virtual world, you talk about AI. Describe, of course some of us are accustomed to these virtual worlds. My kid, who's 12, has been playing Roblox from the age of 4, right? Everything, her whole existence is in Roblox. She communicates with her friends there, she shops for clothing, using tokens and so forth. She's accumulated, every asset she has resides in Roblox. But tell us more about this virtual world and how will it impact all of us?
So the idea for this book actually started in 2018 when my first book came out. It took about a year and a half to write, which is unusual for me. I usually take half a year. But in fact, it took about 6 years to think about. And what happened in 2018, Kishore Mahbubani, you may all know him, has followed these developments very closely himself. I'm curious about what he thinks. But what happened in 2018 is I started to hear this expression that possibly we will in the future live in a Chinese world. And the expression kind of struck me as very interesting to think about. What does it mean to live in a Chinese world? Because I thought the world we live in is not Chinese or American, it's the physical world of mountains, oceans, rivers, straits, the sky, the earth, the planets. How is this Chinese? And slowly I started to think about one very exciting, intellectually exciting possibility, that this physical world is disappearing, that we are all migrating to a virtual world. And the virtual worlds, as opposed to the physical one, can actually be Chinese, or American, or Indian, because they can be built by China, they can be built by the US. And whoever builds these virtual worlds remains in control. It has access to the control panel. It can change some of the configurations. It can change the state of the world. In fact, we saw that during the Ukraine war, when at one point, Russia thought that it had 600 billion in reserves at the European Central Bank and the Federal Reserve in New York, and just with a touch of a button, those 600 billion disappeared. This is like a video game where you have access to the control panel of the game.
No, we see it every day. If you're using DeepSeek, which I've been using for about a week, you don't get to read anything on Tiananmen Square. And if you're on Instagram, you don't see things on Gaza, or less than you would think. Or TikTok is quite different to other platforms, or ChatGPT. We're sort of there now, right? But this sort of greed for owning that space, but that will surely exist parallel to actual territorial control as well, given what's going on in Ukraine or Gaza, or even President Trump's ambitions to conquer Greenland.
That's a challenge the book tries to take on. Does physical territory still matter? And what I argue is that there are really two levels. There's the level of the battle for physical territory in Ukraine, but there's a higher level, a second level, an upper level, where many of the things that happen in the lower level are being decided, if not everything. And that higher level is the level of technology, is the level of energy, is the level of trade, is the level where AI is being developed. Even in Ukraine, I think it's very clear that this is where things are being decided. It's the technology that Ukraine has access to. It's the sanctions against Russia. It's the question of whether the sanctions can be global or not global. It's very clear to me that one of the reasons Russia has been able to withstand the pressure is that the world economy has changed considerably. India and China and Indonesia continue to import Russian energy. And that probably was not fully anticipated, but revealed that the world economy is much more distributed. And unless the United States and Europe can somehow bring India and China on board, they won't be able to isolate Russia, and Russia will not lose the war. That has become clear to me over the past 3 years. So even though there's a level of the physical battle in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, I don't think that's where things are decided. And by the way, maybe you want to talk a little bit about China. I think China agrees with me on this, because you see that China is focused, laser focused on developing these virtual worlds of the future, and it thinks that this is how it replaces the US as the prominent power. It's not through a physical battle in Taiwan, in my opinion.
Well, if you look at this arms race when it comes to AI, I mean, how significant is it? One. B, is it a winner-takes-all situation? The first country, I mean, obviously, you cannot see a company achieving this. It has to be a consortia of companies and governments achieving AGI, artificial general intelligence. And is it a case of winner takes all if a country was to get there first?
Very possibly. I think this is where the scenario I was talking about earlier truly materializes. This is where the world can truly become Chinese or American. Because the foundational AI model is going to be present everywhere. It will be, as you already said, it will be impossible to have access to neutral information. Even now, when you go on the internet, a lot of the internet, we don't know what percentage, is coming from AI models. So it's going into the internet with those biases that were fed into the AI model originally. There is no AI model that is neutral, unbiased, impartial. It thinks in a certain way, and it teaches us to think in a certain way. We live inside these AI models. And that's why the battle is truly, I wouldn't even say existential, it's a battle about how to redefine reality. And there will be no reality outside these new realities being created. The second reason, you may well be right, that this is a winner takes all, is that we've seen this with DeepSeek. The interesting thing about DeepSeek that the other models don't have is that it works through reinforcement learning. The machine, the model, learns by itself. It doesn't have to be taught in supervised learning. In fact, when you use it, you see it, that is thinking aloud. It's very different from ChatGPT.
Well, it's quite extraordinary, because I caught up with a friend of mine who's an early investor in Palantir, Facebook, Tesla, Anduril, which is a drone company, and I had breakfast with him, and I said, listen, do the Chinese have a chance? And he told me about an experience. He went to China, and he met these founders of this technology company, and they're US educated, and every component they purchased, software and hardware, was bought from a Western aligned country. And he said the Chinese have zero chance. And up until last week, everyone believed that. So there are two battles between, so let's call it the Eastern bloc, the Chinese and their allies, and the Western bloc. Who's going to win that, A? And B, there's another battle. How do we control AI?
Said, maybe I'm wrong about this, but when it comes to the dangers of AI, I'm much more alert to the dangers of coming under the control of other human beings, or other states, or other powers that use AI. They're coming under the control of AI itself. There's a line in Dune, the science fiction book, I don't know if it appears in the movies or not, that you remember there's a Butlerian jihad against thinking machines, and there's a line in the book that says something like, at one point human beings learn to use thinking machines in order to control other human beings. And that's how I see it. I don't see a danger of AI controlling us. I see the danger of some people behind the scenes creating a new virtual world, a video game that resembles the real world, but they are still behind programming all the biases, and able to change the settings anytime they want. But the process is accelerating. If we have these models that can learn and think by themselves, that can teach themselves, then development will not happen at human speed, it will happen at computer speed. And whoever starts this accelerating process first will probably be impossible to catch up. That's why the battle is so intense right now between the United States and China. A bit of a pity. I just followed the India debate because I've been in India for 2 weeks. I followed the India debate. There's a lot of frustration because India should have been here. There's perhaps even more logic that India should be part of this group than the European Union. It had the ability to do that. Very well-qualified young workforce that knows how to program these machines.
Well, if Trump becomes really restrictive with the visas, maybe a lot of engineers will stay back and develop things locally. One of the interesting things is about human nature and how we're changing as human beings. And if you look at the stats in terms of young people, especially young men under the age of 30, they're disengaged, they're not particularly socially active, they don't drink as much, which can be interpreted as a bad thing because they don't go out. And something like a third of young adult men have not had sex the last 12 months, the last data I saw. How does technology in this virtual world you're talking about, how is it changing us?
It's certainly dehumanizing us in the respects you mentioned, but also in the overwhelming weight of propaganda. This has been, as I said at the beginning, one of the things that has shocked me over the past 2 years. It seems thicker and more difficult to overcome than propaganda in the past, and maybe that's not surprising, because this is a new kind of propaganda on the internet. It is extremely powerful, more powerful than propaganda in the past, because it's the kind of propaganda you cannot get out of. We used to be beings that lived in the physical world and occasionally did some things on the internet. And 20 years ago, that's, I think, the world as it existed. But it's not the world anymore. Now we are beings that live on the internet and occasionally do one or two things in the physical world. Occasionally come out to eat in the physical world, but go back immediately to the internet. Sometimes when I go to conferences, people ask me, what is the capital of the world? Is it Beijing, or is it still New York, or is it maybe London, is it Dubai? And I used to say, it's Twitter. It's not a physical city anymore. This is where everything is being discussed and everything.
It's a pretty ugly place, Twitter, nowadays.
Yeah. Well, maybe there will be another platform. But you have to ask yourself, would you prefer to live in Manhattan and be banned from accessing the internet? Or would you prefer to live in a small village in Uttar Pradesh and have access to the internet? I know I would prefer to live in a small village and have access to the internet. I would feel much more left out, wandering around, someone said he's sitting in a cafe without any device, without a laptop, without a phone, like a serial killer. I saw this line on Twitter the other day. And if you're wandering around Manhattan without access to the internet, there's something, you're some kind of vagrant or serial killer, but not a human being anymore, because we live on the internet.
But you didn't answer my question. Who's going to prevail in this race? China or the US?
Look, this is the book is about a game that I call the world game, and it's about the states that are programming the game, and that's the United States and China. But the thing about a game is that you don't know the outcome until the end. And I don't think I'm evading the question. I think it's in the nature of what is being played right now. It's in the nature of the game itself. I think you were watching Arsenal last night at 1:30. I think Benfica also won. You don't know the outcome until the very last minute. And that's the nature of the geopolitical game.
Well, the fact that you think it's a 50-50 thing is extraordinary, because up until a week ago, there was no doubt that the Western alliance would prevail, just because of the amount of money it has. In general, yes. But let's look at the world today. A much more fragmented world. You wrote about Eurasia. You talked about the merger of Asia and Europe, because there are so many things that we have in common, culture and so forth. But you fast forward to 2025, the world seems a lot more fragmented. As a matter of fact, culture is one of the points that has divided people, in particular in Europe, and sentiments towards immigrants, and we're seeing that in the US. And today, you're looking at US government policies. The United States president is more combative with his allies than he is with his traditional enemies. So how will that impact things?
Well, two things on that. First, on China, very quickly. I started to have many doubts about this narrative that China would collapse very quickly when I was living in China in 2018, 19. And I remember going to an internet conference. And at some point, the conference was distributing the awards of the year, the winners in internet innovation. It was a room 10 times the size of this room, or 20 times the size of this room, completely full. Young men, they're all men, would come to the stage and receive an award. The audience of about 10,000 people would erupt in applause, and I would even call it adulation, running to the stage, taking photos of these young men. And I was just looking at that and thinking, there's no way that this country is not going to be able to compete with the US on innovation. In fact, because you cannot go into politics, all your energy is channeled into these areas, particularly of technological innovation. And I thought this is going to be extremely powerful. When DeepSeek happens, I feel a little bit vindicated in some of the things I said in the past. I think it shows that. Now, the question of integration, it's a difficult one, because on the one hand, I think the West is breaking some of these connections, but they are deepening in the rest of the world. In fact, now you see many parts of the world that are connecting between each other for the first time. There used to be a model where, even India and the Gulf would connect through Europe. Now India and the Gulf connect directly. So it's a very important story that we shouldn't lose track of. Yes, the West is becoming very suspicious of the rest of the world because it feels weaker and it feels under threat. But that also shows that it's a more global world. When I wrote my first book, Europe was still a place where everyone discussed the relations between Germany and France all the time, obsessively. Now, no one talks about this. Now what we talk about is India, China, Russia, the Gulf, so on and so forth.
Well, the Americans have certainly left a vacuum in our neck of the woods in the Middle East, and that's allowed countries like Turkey to step in. Will we see an acceleration of regional powers stepping in? And how will that impact your thesis in terms of this dominance in the virtual world? Or will they not attempt to dominate things? Which one will it be, do you think?
I think there's different strategies that medium-sized countries can take. They can pick one area and become also a world builder in that specific area if they channel their resources into that area. They can try to be a good player of the game even though they're not programming it. That's quite possible. There are countries that are more successful playing in the existing world order than the countries that built that order. Singapore and Switzerland are more successful playing the game as it exists now than the United States, even though the United States largely designed the game. So that also happens, surprisingly. There are countries that will just align with one of the superpowers completely. I think already we're seeing, for example, the
United States. But do you think countries will have, for example, if you look at the United Arab Emirates, they're very keen to invest in OpenAI. But it was made clear to them, it's either the Chinese or us. So then G42, which is the company that's been obviously investing heavily in this sector, had to divest of all its interests in China, in Huawei and so forth. Do you think, because it's so important to prevail, that countries and companies will be given the option rather with us or against us?
I don't think that the American strategy from the last few years is truly sustainable of trying to isolate China. I think it will soon become apparent that if you try to isolate China, you will eventually isolate yourself. China is not the Soviet Union. It's present everywhere. It's becoming appealing to many countries. One of the impacts of DeepSeek, I think, is that many people all over the world are going to start using DeepSeek. The brand is going to become quite powerful. The company or the Chinese authorities, I don't know if Chinese authorities were involved in this decision, I suspect they were, decided to offer the model for free. You can install it in your own, for $6,000 you can run the program locally. So I suspect that even in India, in Bangalore, people are going to start using DeepSeek because the problems of security are not present. You install it locally. China will have no access to it whatsoever, but you run the model for $6,000 in your own machines. So we already see that this strategy of isolating China entirely, removing it from the rest of the world, isolating it in a corner, is not going to work. And in fact, I think it's perhaps one of the very few positive things of a Trump presidency, is I already see signs that Trump is realizing this is a fool's errand and not very interested in pursuing it.
Well, there's a lot to talk about, and we don't have enough time, but I want to go back to the Middle East. General Petraeus, I think in 2007, asked, how will this end? I want to ask you about Ukraine. How will that end? How will Ukraine end? I want to ask about Gaza. These two subjects that you've been very vocal on. And then, of course, we'll put it to the audience. I'm sure they have lots of questions as well.
In general, I think these two stories are still going to be very tragic and very difficult to end in a way that we consider positive. Let me say that for me it's very simple how I want both stories to end. I want both stories to end with a free, prosperous, sovereign Ukraine and a free, prosperous, sovereign Palestine. And I even see parallel stories in the development of Palestinian and Ukrainian national identity is very powerful in the 20th century. So for me, they are parallel stories, and I wish they were seen that way. But I fear that the stories not always end well. Ukraine, it's possible that there will be a deal sacrificing Ukrainian territory, but it would have to be in exchange for NATO membership or some hard security guarantees. So it remains very difficult, but that's the deal as I see it at the end of the road. And perhaps we can hope it's possible. In Gaza, I have to say that from the beginning, I have a very deep sense of tragedy. I fear that Gaza has disappeared. Many Palestinians tell me this. It's not for me to say, but many Palestinians in Gaza tell me this, that it will be impossible to rebuild Gaza. And I don't see how that can be done. I think at some point we'll find out how many people have been killed and we'll all be shocked. I keep hearing numbers in private that no one wants to make public, and they are shocking numbers. I'm not going to tell them here, they are shocking numbers. Perhaps close to, not an order of magnitude greater than what we hear in public, but hundreds of thousands of killed people in Gaza. So how do you reconstruct this society out of nothing? And I think, there has to be now accountability. We do have to insist that the ceasefire be capped and move to phase 2. We have to also be focused on the West Bank, make sure that West Bank doesn't become a second Gaza. And hopefully one day it will be possible to travel to the capital of a free, sovereign, prosperous Ukraine and the capital of a free, prosperous, sovereign Palestine.
Hopefully. Amen. I think I'm sure people have questions. Kishore Mahbubani, academic, Singapore's top civil servant. I think he'd like to say something. Is there a microphone? There's a mic? Oh, okay. They're having a debate about the microphone. Must be hard to see with the sunglasses.
Thank you. By the way, congratulations on launching your book, and I must commend you for your exceptional courage in speaking about Gaza. Seriously, I've never met anybody who's been as clear and as outspoken as you've been. I think, as you can see, the audience appreciates that very much. And I also agree with your general comment. There's something fundamental is changing in the world. I think that's what your book will try to convey to us. But for me, the thing that's puzzling is that if there's one part of the world that should be intelligently adapting to these changes, it should be your continent, Europe. It's the very prosperous, affluent, well-informed, well-educated part of the world. And yet, surprisingly, Europe is resisting adaptation and adjustment. I'll give you a simple example. If you look at just EU and China, in the year 1980, European Union was 10 times bigger than China. Today it's the same size as China. By 2050, it will be half the size of China. In one lifetime, it's gone from being 10 times bigger to becoming half the size. So you've got to adjust to a new China. But instead of adjusting, you have Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister of Germany, giving lectures to China, what China should do about its society. You have somebody else, Kaja Kallas, the High Representative, saying it's time to break up Russia. So these are examples of the reluctance of Europe to change. And I, as a friend of Europe, believe that Europe can help the world a lot more if it makes intelligent adjustments and adaptations, and perhaps even guide the United States to dealing with the world differently. Is that conceivable or possible that there are European minds thinking along these lines?
Well, you know, when you're on top of the world, when you rule or colonize the whole world with one or two exceptions, if any, then you have to adapt to a world of sharing power, dividing power with others. That is very difficult. Maybe it's difficult in individual life, it's difficult in the life of the nations. I think what we see is a very traumatized Europe. I mean, there's a little bit of Schadenfreude in India about this. I think sometimes I do hear people that say, well, it's a lesson that Europe should have learned at some point, and it's not a bad thing that it's learning it now. You have to share powers ideas, but the process is extremely traumatic. And in fact, you know, one thing I've learned in the past 2-3 years is that this decline of the West is not going to be a soft decline where the West adjusts to its own decline. We used to believe this. No, it is going to be a violent adjustment. The West is going to lash back. It's going to try to preserve its position through any kind of means. And so it's going to be a very ugly process. I'm sorry to say this, and I didn't used to believe this. I believed in the thesis of the soft adjustment. I think it will be a hard adjustment with some violent reaction. I see evidence of this everywhere. And what happened in Gaza, where suddenly, you know, my liberal friends, you know, Gideon Levy, who will speak right after, he likes to say that the Israeli left turned out not to be very serious. Because when things become a little bit harder, they join the hard right. And the European liberals turned out not to be very serious. Because when the war became more difficult, they immediately abandoned their commitments. And now we even see people flattering Trump all the time. Or people joining the radical right. And you know, the more they join the radical right, the more powerful the radical right becomes. We'll see what AfD does in Germany, but I suspect they will be extremely close to the CDU at about 25% of the vote. And that's the trend in Europe. Essentially means that Europeans don't accept this new world and will fight back. I don't think they will be successful. We will be successful, but you know, hopefully other voices will join and we'll have a different strategy.
Gentleman over there.
Hi, my question is about Bangladesh. As you mentioned that Western influence is declining throughout the world in geopolitics. So I have read on the internet that conspiracy theory that USA had a vested interest in St. Helena Island in Bangladesh. So that's why they orchestrated the coup in the Bangladesh. But in the mainstream media, we hear a different version, like it's about radical elements who orchestrated the coup in Bangladesh. So what are your views about that?
You know, I don't know enough, and I will not speculate on who, usually when I go into these sort of discussions about who is behind the scenes, I need to know the country very, very deeply. So in Ukraine, I can talk about whether there was a coup in 2014 or not. I was there, I was talking to everyone, there wasn't a coup. But I will not, excuse me, but I'll not speculate on Bangladesh. The only thing I want to say about Bangladesh and about Pakistan, I was in Pakistan before coming here. Increasingly, you see countries like Bangladesh and Pakistan, population, some of the most populous countries in the world, things are not going well. The countries are breaking apart in many respects. I've been going to Pakistan a lot, but this time around what I saw was different in scale. It's a country that on a fundamental level doesn't seem to work anymore, and most Pakistanis agree with that. And then, the conclusion I draw, and I talk about this in the book, is how can you say that the existing world order is working when increasingly you can give a very long list of countries that don't seem to have a role in the existing order. And because mentioning China is always very polemical, I won't even mention China. Although I think China should have a role in the existing order. But how about Africa? 70, 75, 80 years after decolonization, we still don't see what is Africa's role in the global economy. We still don't have an answer to that. Are Africans supposed to continue waiting? New generations of Africans are supposed to live their suspended lives for 1, 2 more generations? Why isn't there a role for Africa? So it's a global order that increasingly seems diminished, that increasingly seems only able to appeal to a very, very small group of countries. And the role that the United States had after the Second World War, which is a very positive role, of bringing in Japan and creating a role for Japan in the world economy, it's no longer playing that role in respect to many other countries.
Really, we can talk about Pakistan for the next 4 hours, I think. Me as an Afghan, I certainly have my views. I think we're out of time, right?
One more question, or no time for that?
Should we have one more question? Why don't you ask a question anyway? Sorry.
Be quick. Yes, very, very quick because we don't have time. The book discusses this a lot. I've come to the conclusion that world orders are closely connected, intimately connected to energy orders. The United Kingdom became the ruler of the world because it led the first energy revolution, coal and the steam engine. The United States became the global ruler because it led the second energy revolution, which was not so much oil, but it was electricity, as I explained in the book. And I see that in China there's the conviction that the replacement in the global order will be connected with a replacement in energy sources. And that solar is truly the energy of the future. Not very encouraging for the United States to see that every politician will be mocking solar, as if solar is the solar of the early hominids being warmed up by the sun. Solar energy, when you start studying it, is a futuristic form of energy. The idea of solar energy only became possible in Einstein's paper of 1905 on the photon. This is the theoretical sources of solar energy. There's a big prejudice, misconception, that solar energy is a primitive form of energy, where in fact it's a very advanced form of energy. And that's all I have to say now because I keep seeing the 000s there. But thanks for your question.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Bruno.